In this third episode, I'm going to show you how Podimo and journalist Kristoffer Eriksen orchestrate a covert, false flag media operation designed to clean up Jesper public image. Jesper, a music manager and producer, who came forward not to tell the truth but to destroy the reputation of his ex-wife, the mother of his child. Was this operation meant to protect him from potential drug trafficking charges? Or was it simply revenge, the classic pattern of narcissistic abusers, as Dr. Bushra Hanif explained in episodes 1 and 2? She reminded us clearly the type of man does not stop. They continue to harass their former partners. In Barman then Forkerte, the child with the wrong person, Jesper portrays his ex-wife as crazy, mentally unstable, and dangerous. And Kristoffer Eriksen uses his own journalist credibility not to investigate, but to validate Jesper's claim. Claims based not on evidence, not on reporting, but on Jesper's monologue. This is a severe violation of journalist ethics. It gets worse. An interview in Sound Venue, a major outlet owned by Jesper's business associate, Michael Reto. Coincidence? Hardly. For this episode, we consulted Danish expert Emilia Charlotta Kent-Gerig, who breaks down the staggering ethical failures behind Barman then Forkerte. Failures Podimo denied in a letter sent to my lawyer, where they falsely accused me of spreading the story. Even though I had only 3,000 followers, 95% of them French. Yet, the moment the podcast was released, my Instagram stories magically appeared on Reddit, on a Danish Reddit thread for the first time in my life. A coincidence? Or a convenient strategy to generate engagement around a sharky show made by an equally sharky team? Let's find out. This is Accusations Future, part 3 of They Made Me Leave My Country.
So now to elaborate what Podimo did as a work, as the journalist work they pretend, we're going to ask a journalist, a Danish journalist, what she think about the work they made with factual questions. And I'm going to just let her introduce herself. So, Emilia, hi.
Hello.
How are you?
Well, first of all, I'll make very good. I'll make a brief correction. I work with strategy in media, so I'm educated from the Media and Journalism School in Denmark, and I am specialized in the strategic work in media. So my role in, let's say, a media institution like Podimo would be above the journalist. So it would be overseeing the work of the journalist and placing the product in the market and working also with the PR.
Okay, so it's more than being just a journalist, how we can say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So now we clarify the Emilia position. I just wanted to ask you a few questions. So the first question is, as a journalist, why is contradiction crucial during an interview? And what happens when no contradictory questions are asked?
Yes. If no contradictory questions are asked, then the interview becomes a curated, one-sided narrative. And when you only have one main source, as in the case of Podimo, where it's Jesper's version of, chain of events, and it's slightly supported by some sources, then you have the option as a journalist to ask contradictory questions to Jesper's statements. So you test his proclamations, you test his let's say, point of view. If you choose not to do that, then it's not journalism. It becomes a potential smear campaign, or it becomes facilitation of self-promotion, basically. And it becomes a PR project more than it's journalism. A PR project for in this case, Jesper. And that's very problematic, especially when you frame your media product. In this case, it's an entire podcast series of 9 episodes. When it's presented and framed and marketed as a piece of journalism, then you're using the journalistic credibility to greenlight, blue stamp, sort of verify what's being presented. But if you're not actually doing the contradictory questions in all 9 episodes, then you're basically just holding the microphone for someone who, in this case, is doing an unequivocal smear campaign.
Okay.
And in Podimo's case, the journalist, Kristoffer Eriksen, he's trying to meticulously present it as if he's given Julie the option of making comments, and he's had access to all this material. You know, he says thousands of videos and photos and screenshots and government papers, etc. But it still remains that he's only presented with what Jesper has given him. So he has still only been presented to material that has been chosen to be presented by one party. And he doesn't question this at any point. He doesn't even mention it, actually. And it becomes very problematic. And I would say there's a main point that I'd like to make today, is that media should not be used for a smear campaign. And we'll get into that further along our interview today. So, there are some core values when it comes to journalism, some internationally agreed upon ethics for journalism. And one is accuracy. There has to be the absolute goal of striving for accuracy. So when depicting or presenting a story and a series of events, you have to journalistically make the effort to be as accurate as possible. And the second core value is independence, that you're treating the material from an independent point of view, that you're not citing. That comes to my third point of impartiality. But independence also refers to working on an independent foundation, where you're not paid by a corporate media to present a certain message and becomes PR, or if you're paid to do a certain message, and that could be officially or unofficially. And the fourth core value of ethical journalism is that you have to have humanity in the way you treat the material and the way you treat your sources. And you have to have humanity in terms of who does this message and this communication affect. In this case, the communication affects Julie, and it affects the children involved, the families involved. And the fifth core value is accountability. There has to be accountability for the statements that are made, and they have to be challenged. And I think it's very important to establish these core values, because you can actually test the quality of this podcast by bouncing it up against the wall of these 5 core ethics of journalism.
Okay. And to be precise, because a lot of people don't know like the specific word, what is a PR work, just to be precise in one sentence?
So PR work in one sentence is you're doing a communication to build and maintain a positive public image for either an organization or a client.
Okay.
So that's the basic of PR. And to give it a contrast so people better understand, you have the contrast is the journalism, where the goal is to inform the public with objective news and facts.
Okay.
So that's the main difference between the two. There are other differences as well, but you could say in this case, the project is depicted as being something that serves society because it's a broader topic of child custody cases, which is a noble cause, of course. But if the communication around that avoids conveying information that harms the client in this case, then it's PR. And in the case of this podcast, I think it's fair to say that objectively, this podcast avoids conveying information that harms Jesper.
Okay.
And thus it is PR. It becomes PR.
Okay. So now
I'll get into the details of what they're avoiding talking about and asking about.
Yes, yeah. We go on there in the next question. So just for the audience, so now you understand the context and you understand what we're talking about. And when I say they didn't follow the journalism procedure and method, this is why I do this interview. So now we go further now in questions. And the second question is, when an interview lacks verification and only presents one person's narrative, can we still call it journalism, or does it become PR work? That's what we just answered a little bit, but can you elaborate a little more about it?
Yes. Well, I'll try to pull it into the context of this podcast, where you have one side, which is Jesper's side, that is being presented, and he is, in many regards, the narrator alongside the journalist Kristoffer Eriksen, who is also narrating for him in these intersected monologues. However, it continues to be where the sympathy and the presentation is in favor of Jesper's version of events. At no point during these 9 episodes is his version of events truly challenged. And what's also problematic is that Jesper's background is not addressed at all, and his behavior, the sum of his own behavior, is not addressed either. So you have one person smearing another person who's not present, and these smears are not challenged. So you have the sum total of a media product that serves one person's interest, in this case, Jesper's interest, his presentation of reality. And then that becomes PR and not journalism. Because the journalism doesn't ask critical questions to Jesper about his own behavior, about his own, stake in the game, it stops being journalism. And there are some critical accusations that Jesper presents, and these are introduced in the very first episode. And these accusations are left unchecked. So they frame the entire podcast series through that lens. And it's primarily about the mental state of Julie. That is introduced within the first 10 minutes of the first episode, and it's repeated throughout the episodes. So the listener is constantly listening to what's being presented through the lens of Julie being mentally ill. At no point is that actually truly challenged, and at no point is Jesper asked whether he has any mental issues, which would be quite relevant to this case and chain of event. He's also not challenged about his alcohol abuse and drug abuse, which is highly relevant to what's presented throughout the 9 episodes. And I find it very strange for a journalist, if he's supposed to be acting in good faith, that he doesn't address these very critical aspects of the whole controversy between the two. Because those are critical aspects that would explain some of Julie's reactions to various behaviors if it were viewed or listened to through the lens of a man with a serious alcohol and drug abuse. And a third very critical aspect that I'm extremely surprised that this specific journalist doesn't address, it's the whole theme of drugs, a big amount of drugs that are running through the story line. And this is not, he doesn't ask any critical questions about these large amount of drugs that keep, flowing through the storyline. And it's particularly strange because this particular journalist actually has another podcast that deals solely with gang-related material and drug and gang-related material. So he is very well versed in large amounts of drugs, and it would be very relevant to ask more contradictory questions as to where do all these drugs come from, and is there some kind of drug relation in this whole series of events. And that aspect would support Julie's accusations throughout the story. So it would essentially puncture the bubble of Julie being erratic and irrational and mentally unstable when she is addressing all these things in her relationship with Jesper.
Okay, thank you. So as you can hear now, you understand better what I was saying about the fact that he don't ask the real questions, and Emilia just explained you that if you ask question, it was not a question, it was just a monologue from Jesper, and the journalist just take this monologue. But we go further in this. In this,
Yes, sorry.
we go on the third question, or you have something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to just add on to that. When the journalist does his own monologues that are intercepting throughout these 9 episodes, he is using his credentials as a journalist to essentially verify the monologues that Jesper just had throughout the series. He doesn't challenge them at all, and it's let's say when you're doing intercepting monologues journalistically, it's an option to reflect on the statements made by your main source. So it would be an option to let the audience know what you're aware of, what you're not aware of, which kind of, let's say, journalistic questions that you have in terms of what has just been stated. But he doesn't do that. He simply just verifies and cements the storyline that has just been presented by his main source, Jesper.
Yeah.
Which loops back to the point about whether this is more of a PR work than it's actual journalism. And since I would say an overall conclusion is that Jesper's statements aren't challenged. They're not challenged throughout these 9 episodes, nor is his problematic behavior analyzed. So throughout these 9 episodes, he's talking quite often about being hungover or drunk or very intoxicated by alcohol and drugs. And he frames it as, well, just a lot of partying and a lot of partying and a lot of partying. But the sum of his behavior is never analyzed by the journalist. It's never critically addressed by the journalist, which is quite strange since Julie's accusations depicted is that she's very dissatisfied about the erratic substance abuse and alcohol abuse. So by not addressing it, he's just leaving Julie's accusations as if they're just, absurd, baseless, blah, blah. But you have a main source that is actually alluding to a lot of alcohol and drugs being involved. So by addressing that, he could have supported those accusations made by Julie, but he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And since the sum of Jesper's own actions aren't presented, but Julie's actions are summed up continuously, and there's like a picture painted about her being, very unfair, unreasonable, not being able to distinct reality from fiction, etc., then you have a very, I would say, flawed presentation of events, and I think it's very unfortunate. And because Jesper just depicts these accusations that Julie presented, so it's actually a secondhand presentation of the accusations. The journalist absolutely has a duty to follow up with contradictory questions to either verify or elaborate or debunk those specific accusations, and he doesn't do that. So it's problematic that Julie's accusations are continuously framed as insane, baseless, or false flag operations. And by false flag operations, I mean the instance of whether drugs were planted in Jesper's office building. What would be extremely relevant to that specific statement that Jesper makes, he's telling the story about how a large amount of drugs were left in a package in his office building. And he's trying to present it as if Julie had planted those drugs. And, just, this is so insane, she planted drugs. And what I find very problematic is the fact that the journalist, who, keep in mind, simultaneously has another podcast that is solely focused on gangs and drugs with in-sources within the environment of gangs, it would be very relevant to ask, how did such a large amount of drugs wound up in your office building? Where did those drugs come from? Is there a certain gang related to this office? Jesper says himself throughout the 9 episodes that there's quite a lot of drugs in his office, but he just presents this as partying. But it would be extremely relevant to ask whether there is a drug relationship, a gang-related relationship within the sphere of Jesper. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't do that.
No.
So I would say he's not acting in good faith, because this is material that is very well known to him. And I would say Jesper's relationship with drug cartels or pushers, depending on how you view things, it's not pursued at all. And just to reiterate, it's very relevant. Where did all these drugs at all these parties come from? Who supplied all these drugs? And it's also very problematic that Jesper's alcohol and drug abuse, it's not pursued. He's never asked any contradictory questions about it. And I would say objectively that addiction is synonymous with erratic and immoral and violent behavior. So it's a relevant aspect to Julie's accusations about violence, if it is a fact that this is a man that has a very heavy alcohol and substance abuse. But these things are never addressed seriously in the podcast. And additionally, you have Jesper's mother. I think it would be a relevant question whether she has an alcohol abuse, because it's sort of alluded that she has a very, I don't know what you want to call it, close relationship to alcohol. And from a mother perspective or parent perspective, if a person is constantly intoxicated by alcohol or pills, as in her case, I've been made aware of, then she's not fit to babysit or interact with children as a general conclusion, right? So it would be very relevant to ask contradictory questions to Jesper to either verify or debunk whether his mom has an alcohol problem. But that never happens. And I think it's fair to say that the reason why those questions aren't asked is because it would make Julie's accusations sound rational, and it would make Jesper's background look less glorified, right?
Yeah.
And I think overall, objectively, I would say that all possible explanations for Julie's reactions are not pursued. And that is a consistent theme throughout these 9 episodes, is that this journalist never explores possible explanations for her reactions. And then it stops becoming journalism. It stops being journalism.
Yeah. And I wanted to add a point that, if you allow me, that about the drug planted, as a journalist, you should verify the court decision, and the court says Julie is acquitted, then you should say it in the podcast that she is acquitted, and then why you still continue to accuse her if the justice said she is acquitted. Then the decision of justice should be added to the podcast, that then people know that it went nowhere. Because if you accuse someone to do that large amount of drug, police supposed to know. Authority is supposed to know. That no one. And my question was in the podcast before, then what the justice is doing, because if it's not her, like you said, who it is? Where the drug come from?
Who is it then?
Who is it then?
Yeah.
Because if the justice said clearly it's not her, and you continue to accuse her, which is not legal to continue to accuse someone when the justice said it's not the person, but anyway, who it is? And at no point, Kristoffer Eriksen asked that question. And that means he didn't even look for the court decision to add to the podcast.
But you can zoom out and look at the other statements that involve drugs. It's not only the case of the planted drugs or non-planted drugs in his office building. It's also all the parties that he's talking about, all the events at his office building where drugs were involved.
Yep.
So he's he's casually presenting himself as being like a party animal, and that there were a lot of parties at his office, and there were often drugs present at his office. It would be extremely relevant to ask, where did those drugs come from? If there was a consistent supply of drugs to your office, where did those drugs come from? Because it's sorry to say, outside the music business, it's not normal behavior.
Yeah.
And large quantities of drugs don't come from just a 15-year-old pusher hanging around the streets or whatever. It comes, when it's large amounts of drugs, it comes directly from some kind of gang, some kind of organized crime. And since this particular journalist has this simultaneous podcast that solely focuses on gangs and on organized crime, he is very well aware of how these things work. But he completely ignores that aspect in this podcast. So what's going on? And I think it's a very relevant question, whether this journalist has been acting in good faith. And I would objectively say no.
Yeah. If we go to the third question, I think you partially answer to my third question, but do you have anything to add on what are the main inconsistencies and missing elements to make the investigation incomplete? You answered, sorry, a lot about it, but if you have something to add.
Yeah, I would say when you have situations where you only have one source in a conflict between two people, and you only have the version of this one person, and you're trying journalistically to support that version or trying to investigate by adding on some sources. When you only have that one person's perspective and statements, then you're obligated to challenge those statements real time. And as we've said a few times already, talking about these contradictory questions. Contradictory questions is, I'll give an example. Jesper says, Julie had this she was talking about this diagnosis, right, of mental illness. A contradictory question would be, do you have any mental illnesses yourself? Or do you have you ever seen anything that would support this specific diagnosis, and what does that truly mean? I'd say the overall problem is that as a journalist, you're supposed to be seeking objective truth. And in many respects, it's quite similar to when a police investigator is seeking objective truth in a criminal case. Mm-hmm. So you always look into what are the different motives and explanations, and you go on both sides. If it's a conflict between two people, you seek out the possible explanations for person one's reactions, person two's reactions. Mm-hmm. So seeking out what possible explanations are there to this behavior. And when you're not pursuing the other perspective, and I understand that he officially says that, well, he tried to get Julie to make comments, etc. And my main point is that he could have challenged the statements made by Jesper real time during his interviews with him. And he could also have used his monologues to reflect on whether there are possible explanations for the accusations that Julie made towards Jesper. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, this aspect of drug and alcohol abuse is very relevant to the accusations that Julie made towards Jesper. And the history of Jesper himself, the way he lived his life before and during the relationship, in terms of with the aspect of alcohol and drug abuse, is very relevant. And what's also very relevant is his entire career background, which is never addressed. And I think we'll get on. I'll address it later on with our questions. But it's extremely relevant when you look into the history and background for both the journalist and for Jesper.
Yeah, and to add to that, because it's like personal matters, like you said, and I wanted to add on, when someone says something and you don't ask yourself why this is problematic, like for example, why we talk about alcohol, a lot of drug. In the studies, it says that people they use a lot of alcohol and drug, they are more violent to their partner than others. Mm-hmm. So there was like a relevant question to ask then, are you a violent person? Because you say you do parties, you do drugs, you do alcohol, and this is typical what violent people do in their life. So are you that type of person? Is there any track record? Can we verify on court that you've never been violent to your partner or any partner? Actually, there was a lot of things that it was never questioned, and we can see sometimes on some people they are a little clever on internet reacted to that, especially women. They say that this is really weird because people they act like that. They're usually violent, but it's like when you never live the situation, you cannot connect the dots, and it's supposed to be the journalist to connect the dots to help. In my opinion, the audience to be fully aware of what they are listening about.
Yes.
So we go on the fourth question. Does the journalist behind the podcast have a history of manipulating facts or presenting bias or sensationalized stories? Because if this is made like that, maybe it's not the first time he did that.
And it's not the first time. I did some digging, as they say. I did some digging about Kristoffer Eriksen, the journalist who does this podcast series, and he has a history of using elaborate lies and deceit for the sake of sensationalism. As an example, he created a fictitious nightclub exclusively for beautiful people, and he presented this in the press as a PR statement, like, I'm doing this nightclub, but it's only for beautiful people. And the press and the general public were like outraged because they found it discriminatory to have whatever place that is exclusively for beautiful people. And then it turned out it was all fake. It was just a lie that he had presented. There was no nightclub. And he did the whole marketing for it. So opening nights with everything, but it was apparently fake. And he did that officially to engage the Danish press corps in spreading false news stories. So he wanted to, officially, his reasoning was that he wanted to prove that the Danish press corps was somewhat unprofessional, that they would just write stories that they hadn't fact checked. That was like his,
which is really funny,
right?
Which is really funny.
He has a history of doing intentional and elaborate lies for sensationalism, and what it also did was undermining his competitors in the news industry. Keep that in mind. So he has a track record where he's shown that he is willing to do elaborate lies that also is somewhat predatory in undermining the professionalism of his competitors, and making a mockery out of an industry, and a mockery out of other people as well. And he had a 3 or 4 year long format that was called S2E10, where the whole concept was to go out into the public and trick people into situations, like it was like satire, so it wasn't exactly slapstick comedy, but it was, taking the piss on regular, unwitting people, unknowing people. So this whole modus operandi of deceiving people is the thing for him. And secondly, I would say that, as I've mentioned earlier, he has had this podcast where he closely follows and depicts gang environments. So journalism with direct sources within these gangs. So he has this in-depth knowledge about drugs and drug trade and gang affiliations. So objectively, it's quite disturbing that he ignores these aspects in the case of Jesper, the record label and drug culture in the music industry, and historic collaborations with drug cartels, because it's a well-known fact about the music industry, when you look at it internationally, that there is a lot of drugs in the music industry, and these drugs are supplied by cartels. It's large amounts, and it's, in a more broader perspective, cartels have a high interest in attaching themselves to artists that all of a sudden make a lot of money because it secures like a constant cash flow. And getting artists addicted to drugs is a way for both record labels to control their artists, and it's a way for drug cartels to have a constant, fat cash flow. And we've seen these examples and these tragic stories about. We just saw it recently with what was his name? Matthew Perry, who OD'd. And in this case, it was doctors who were gang affiliated that were supplying these drugs to him. And according to the court cases around it, it kept bunking up the price for the drugs. And because he's a celebrity and he's not really among, regular people, he doesn't really, if he wants drugs, he wants to buy drugs, you can't really go out in the street and just buy it. It has to be supplied in a more discreet way. And you've seen many other examples of music artists who get addicted to drugs, and they, these huge sensational stories about going to rehab, etc. And what is often seen in when it becomes police investigations, etc., is that you have gangs and cartels directly attached to these artists, as I mentioned, because it's just a business model for them. So, when you have a journalist like Kristoffer Eriksen, who's been working, according to himself, he has these direct sources within these drug cartels, then he is very well aware of how the cash flows run, and especially in and out of the music industry and the record label.
Yeah.
So it's problematic that he completely ignores this aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just the fact that that this journalist has a history of creating these, big lies for sensationalism, as I mentioned earlier, with this nightclub. It was called Eye Candy, by the way.
Okay.
This nightclub that was absolute utter bullshit. And then when you look at Jesper's background, I mean, Jesper is not his real name, it's anonymous, but I'm aware of his name, so I did a little digging, and he has a history of doing these elaborate lies, very serious lies, in my opinion, where he 2 times has created bands. One band that was his own, where it was absolute bullshit. The whole, let's say, personality of the band, the whole character of the band was absolute bullshit. And they would say some very provocative, politically incorrect statements. And he did that to get press. And this has been widely reported in his own interviews, by his own words. When he was younger, by his own words in interviews, he stated that it was to get the attention of people that they created this whole narrative about this band. And then later on in his career, he created a whole artist that was absolutely fictitious, but nobody knew it was fictitious. And so he made a lot of money on this elaborate lie for like 3-4 years, until they revealed to the broader public that, okay, by the way, it was all bullshit. We never meant any of it. It was just a lie. It was just a bunch of lies. The whole thing was fake. And then, very similar to Kristoffer Eriksen, it's like, they kind of feel justified in what they do, because they think that the fact that people fell for it makes the people stupid, so they should be ashamed of falling for the lies. That they don't really have any accountability around it. And I think that's a mental note that we all need to make when we dive into this podcast series, which is a very serious smear campaign. And you just have to ask yourself, how fictitious is it?
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that, because it shows just the pattern.
You have 2 people. You have both the journalist who has a history of doing fictitious things, elaborate lies, and then he's interviewing a person who has a serious track record of elaborate lies, fictitious, sensationalist stories and brands and concepts. There are two people and a microphone telling a story that is a serious smear campaign towards Julie.
Yeah.
And the fact that that Jesper's background isn't addressed at all, it, you know, like I initially stated, I would say this is more PR work for Jesper than it is actual journalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's why I said in the first episode what a real coincidence that they met in the bar when they are so similar, but just my opinion. What makes Jesper tone problematic? Does it sound rehearsed, controlled, or scripted? And how does that affect the credibility? Why I ask that is because a lot of people, they were saying like, he's so calm, he's so controlled, how they analyze him like a victim. And that's also what is said about Julie, like she don't look like a victim. And that's also interesting. What is your opinion so about that?
Well, I mean, the way you interpret tonation and things like that, I mean, of course, a portion of it is subjective, but I would say with my experience in the media industry, he has like an underdog framing and positioning. So he has like a forced, vulnerable tonation and wording. The words he used are like in the very first episode, he's introducing himself and explaining how he met Julie. When he uses words and he uses a framing where he says, "Oh, I was just this fat guy. I didn't know why she even wanted me. I was just this fat guy." And so you already have established that he's the underdog of this relationship. And objectively speaking, I would say that's very unlikely because at that point, this guy was a CEO of a record label. Mm-hmm. And he was hanging around all these famous people. So you're not that much of an underdog. Mm-hmm. Just to be clear. But he's framing himself and using like this very weak tone for speaking in this like, "Oh, I'm just this, it's been so hard, blah, blah, blah," which, I mean, he can do that, but it's never challenged. And because he isn't asked contradictory questions by the journalist, he's never pulled out of what's rehearsed. Mm-hmm. His responses are rarely spontaneous. It isn't until the ninth episode of the podcast, which is an epilogue. So it's a sequence that is made after the podcast. It's like a follow-up sequence. Mm-hmm. And here the journalist, Kristoffer Eriksen, is presenting him with some new factual evidence in a police case, in some other instances, and he's presenting those new things to him real time. And that's actually one of the few instances where you get like a spontaneous response from Jesper. And you can hear that that wasn't really rehearsed, and his responses aren't as effectful as the other previous 8 episodes. So because he's not challenged in the majority of the podcast series, he's allowed to just present his rehearsed narrative, and it's I think it's quite obvious that it's rehearsed. It's not that strange that it's rehearsed. You can't really blame someone for having like a rehearsed presentation of things. But I would say, in my subjective opinion, I find it a little bit obnoxious that he has all these, like the way he uses his voice, he's like intentionally making his voice vulnerable. And he has all these forced pauses when he's telling his story. He has these forced pauses, like in filmmaking, you call it like an artistic pause to really cement a point. And then he has these like breakdowns, but they just, it's a subjective opinion, but to me they feel forced and rehearsed. They don't feel authentic, but they're supported by the podcast editing and supported by music effects, sound effects that are added on, edited in to the episodes, and also supported by these intercepting monologues that Kristoffer Eriksen has. So you basically have a lot of monologue. You have Jesper's monologue, and then you have the journalist's monologue that is obviously recorded separate from the interviews. And then you have these sound effects. So it becomes more fictitious than it becomes investigative, in my opinion. And I would say, as like a general observation of all 9 episodes, is that because these contradictory questions, like questions that would challenge Jesper's statements real time, because they aren't really asked, then it never really shifts from this rehearsed to spontaneous reaction. And that is like I would say, like the very noble position a journalist has to have is to ask these contradictory questions so that the responses reveal something that either builds or destroys the credibility. So much like an interrogation, like asking questions that aren't expected gives spontaneous responses, and those spontaneous responses will reveal things that either build or destroy the credibility of the source. That's why they're so important.
Okay.
So I would say overall, I would say that the podcast is like a carefully crafted storytelling that it seeks to invoke sympathy for Jesper and disdain for Julie. Like the weight of this sympathy objectively is constantly towards Jesper, and the podcast also consistently frames Julie as insane. Like the insanity aspect is something that is addressed in the very beginning, and it's repeated throughout the podcast. So it's constantly repeated that Julie is basically insane, and that framing is never challenged by the journalist. And he also uses his title as a journalist, and he also mentions that continuously throughout the podcast series. He's using his professional stamp of verification to greenlight Jesper's narrative. Mm-hmm. And then he uses these intercepting monologues to cement that perception. And I would say objectively, if he were to conduct proper journalism, he would use monologues to reflect on Jesper's statements and analyze the subject matter and inform the audience of discrepancies and blank spots. But he doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. And so what monologues can be used for, like in a more general sense, when you're in terms of this kind of journalistic work, is that you can use the monologues of the journalist to inform the audience of what you know and what you don't know, and to inform the audience of maybe some more general statistics. Like it would be relevant, like we talked about earlier, it would be relevant to pull out some statistics about violent relationships and alcohol, mm-hmm. right? That would be very relevant, and it would serve the broader public or the general public to be aware of this phenomenon. It could also be very relevant to pull out some statistics from clinical psychology about very volatile dynamics, where there's often at least one party that has some kind of personality disorder, like NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and describing the classical behavior of a narcissist would be very relevant in this case, because if you give a lens where the audience or the listener can reflect on their own, so which party is guilty of what here, mm-hmm. and it also serves as like an educational lens, and because I personally have quite a lot of knowledge about psychology in general, and it should be like common knowledge for a journalist who is looking into crime in general. You have to be aware of the classical traits of NPD because it's statistically often found in crime. And we look at the statistics of violent relationships, there is also a prevalence of NPD statistically. It would be very relevant to address another diagnosis that is often related to violence, which is NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. and that would open up an entire flank and lens in viewing Jesper's actions and behavior. But he doesn't do that.
Yep.
And so, again, we're kind of back to the fact that the journalist doesn't take an objective position where he is trying to explore the possible explanations to Julie's actions.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't do that.
Mm-hmm. And to add on that, you're on the third episode, like you know. Guys, I ask you to go on episode 1 and 2, where I asked Professor and Dr. Bushra Anif, and she explains how women react during the violence and after a violent relationship, and why they act a certain way, how they react, and how it is hard for them to prove that they are or they were in a violent relation, and it still continue in their life to harass them in their work, the relation with the kid, and a lot of things. The doctor explained it very well in episode 1 and 2. So people, if you never watch it, go back on episode 1 and 2 so you will understand clearly what we're talking about, because when you know what science say about it, you understand clearly that there is a lot of questions missing, because if he says she did this, she did that, science says that women, they live in the violent relationship, they are really close to that type of reaction, and it's because of the violence, psychological and physical. I'll let you go there, and you will watch that after you finish this episode, guys. So, question 6: what are the essential steps a journalist must take to conduct a genuine truth-seeking interview, especially in sensitive or conflict-based cases? You answered a little bit about it, but if you have something to add.
Yeah, there are some internationally agreed upon steps of conduct, code of conduct. So you have like 3 different, what do you call it, phases. So the first thing you do is you master the subject matter. So you read all available documents, reports, court filings, and etc. And in this case, the journalist has read all the documents that were presented by Jesper. So his foundation, his journalistic foundation, is from somewhat objective documents from court filings, etc. However, we don't know if Jesper has given him everything, and the journalist doesn't know if Jesper has given him everything, and he has no way of fact-checking that either.
Mm-hmm.
And what I am missing also from this entire podcast is a timeline. I would have loved a timeline of events,
mm-hmm.
But we don't have that. And then what's also crucial for a journalist to do when preparing for that an interview is to build a contradiction file. It's also known as a truth dossier. So it's where you create a chronological timeline. Like I mentioned, the lack of timeline. You don't necessarily present the timeline in your actual interview, but journalistically, it's a very common method to do a timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So that you get an overview of causality. Mm-hmm. So let's say in this case, it would be very useful for the listener to understand the chronology of so you did what, and then she did what, and then you did what, and then she did what. Like this timeline of that. But it's the way it's narrated. It's kind of jumping around and doing things in a more like let's say like a foggy presentation of things. But you would build this contradiction file where, because you have this timeline mapped out, you can also see the event if there are some inconsistencies or if there are gaps in the statements that this interviewee has made in the past. You would usually do like initial talks before you do the actual interview. So by doing this timeline, you're kind of plotting in like, are there any inconsistencies and something I need to understand better, and I can address that in the interview. And it's very similar to how a police investigator would do things. There's quite a few similarities to that, because you're trying to come as close to the truth as possible, and so you're wanting to investigate every single angle and the chronology of things. So I can give like a theoretical example, right? So if I walk out in the street now, and let's say I get struck down by, I don't know, a group of hooligans. Let's just say that, hypothetically. Is it relevant or not whether I had been shouting something at those hooligans 5 minutes earlier? It would be relevant to understanding the situation if the only information that comes out from me telling my story, my side of the story, is that, just all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I was struck down by this group of hooligans, then your sympathy would be with me. I would be like a completely innocent victim of the situation, right? And it would be unpromoted violence. But if I'd been shouting 5 minutes earlier something super provocative, it gives a different dynamic in that conflict. And it's just a theoretical example, but it's just to illustrate why this chronology is so important. And one of the other things is that you do the source diversification, and in this case of this podcast, he's somewhat doing the source diversification by interviewing Julie's former assistant, and he has like a handful of people that he's interviewing to either support or debunk different sides of the story. One aspect I noticed is that one of the early accusations that Jesper makes, and he does that several times actually, he accuses Julie of bribing people who were involved in the case. He accuses Julie of bribing social workers that were connected to the child custody case, and psychologists, etc. And this whole theme of bribery is addressed by Jesper as an accusation towards Julie. At no point does the journalist ask a contradictory questions, which would be, did you bribe anyone? Because if bribe is possible in your reality, then bribe is possible both ways, right? And I think it's quite relevant, especially when you have this aspect of drugs and drug addiction, because I think most people are aware that people who have an active drug addiction, they have a different and very skewed moral compass than normal people. And when you have a drug addict or several drug addicts in your vicinity, then you can also bribe them with drugs to get them to say and do whatever you want. And I'm not necessarily claiming that this is the case for Jesper, but it is a possibility, and it should be explored. It should be asked directly if bribing social workers and other people to accuse you of something. If Julie is capable of bribing people, then there's also a possibility of you bribing people. So we're going to ask, have you bribed any of these people? And how can we trust the sources that are supporting your side of the story? How can we trust that you haven't bribed them? And this is super relevant because Jesper is the one who's bringing up the possibility of bribery.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very relevant to ask him the same question. And it's like a general theme throughout this podcast that he is allowed to accuse Julie of all sorts of things, but the journalist does never asks the other way around. So these accusations, are you doing any of that? And you would also, just to go back on track to your question, in terms of how the journalist is preparing these kind of interviews, is that you also prepare these kill chain questions. It's where you prepare like 3 to 6 of your hardest evidence-based questions that could collapse the interview's narrative. And you could compare it to like the devil's advocate, right? So in this case, the devil's advocate questions would be, do you have a drug problem? Do you have, like, are you a drug addict? Or do you have an alcohol problem?
Mm-hmm.
Because that would collapse a lot of his narrative.
Exactly.
But it's never asked. Yeah.
Exactly.
And also about the aspect of bribery or possible bribery, that would be a kill chain question to ask, okay, so you're accusing Julie of bribing. I would just like to know, have you ever bribed anyone?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's one of those questions where the person you're interviewing doesn't expect the questions, so you get a spontaneous response. And since we all know that people can just lie, but oftentimes when people get a question that they are not expecting, they often react in a way where you can kind of detect whether they're lying or not. You can kind of detect whether you're hitting a nerve or not. So that would have been very useful for the listener to make their own judgment as to whether he's credible, whether he's 100% credible or just 80% credible or just not at all. That would be very relevant. And then there's also the legal and ethical checks where, especially when you have like rape allegations and you have minors involved, especially you run questions through like a legal counsel, so you avoid defamation. And I think in general, Podimo has tried to sort of cover themselves legally by using these other sources. But I would say it doesn't stand actual scrutiny in terms of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when the journalists are doing the journalistic interview, the actual interview, you do like a funnel technique, which is also quite important, where you're moving from like broader open questions to more specific closed questions. And then you have these confrontational contradiction questions. Like I just mentioned, a confrontational question would be, have you ever bribed anyone?
Mm-hmm.
Or have you ever professionally made elaborate lies?
Mm-hmm.
That would be a relevant question. You look at his professional background, which is information that's available to anyone. You can just do some desk research on his professional background.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there are many aspects of this podcast that are sadly left absolutely unchecked. And I think it's very problematic, especially because the consequences of this podcast have been dire professionally to Julie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, her entire professional reputation was absolutely smashed with this podcast, and it's a very serious accusation to frame a person as entirely insane. It kind of works socially and culturally. It works kind of like polio did in the Middle Ages. Like if you have polio, you just get ostracized from society and you get put in your own little isolated island because people are afraid of you. So it's very serious. Yeah. And then Jesper makes another very consistent proclamation around the system of child custody, where he's framing it as if the system is just entirely broken, And it's not that he doesn't have relevant points, and it's not that there isn't issues with it, with that system, but the fact that he factually got the child custody, he won the child custody case, I would just objectively say it's a relevant question to ask him. So if the system is broken and you got the child custody, then there's something wrong, right, with you getting the child custody case, because you said the system is broken.
Mm-hmm.
So it made the wrong decision, or did it? Like, which is it? Is it broken or not?
Real true. Real
Yeah.
true. And to add on the bribery, like I elaborate in episode 1 and 2 that you can follow the people, I wanted to say again, he in court, and he elaborate a little bit in the podcast that she faked a brain bleeding and bribing doctors. I don't know where in the world, or maybe in Denmark it exists, guys. I don't know, because people maybe believe that. But one of the best hospitals in Europe, called American Hospital of Paris, is them that discovered the brain bleeding, and there is a record, and it was easy for a journalist to verify through a doctor. Like it can, like I include a media, for example, it could include a doctor that I can state if yes or no you can bribe a doctor, if yes or no you can fake a brain hemorrhage, a brain bleeding, sorry. All of that. Like, at least they could just fact check that. But for someone who made a mockery about the journalist, they don't fact check. He's the one who don't really fact check what he's doing. But anyway, last question.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I would say even when the journalist chooses to kind of support that illusion of bribery being possible, they kind of contradicting themselves. I'll address them as a team now, basically. So the journalist and Jesper presenting this side of the story, and they're saying that, well, she probably just bribed all these people. Well, then how do we know that you haven't bribed all the sources that you have?
Yep.
I mean, if bribery is possible, then bribery is possible,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
360 degrees around.
Yep. Everyone can bribe them.
Yeah. Apparently. So it's a huge contradiction in my view. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is a huge one. So the last question is, how can a journalist challenge a source respectfully while still exposing contradiction, hidden motive, and manipulation? We've been a lot, I think, all over the podcast through this, but if you have something to add, like a final point in this, like how a journalist can challenge the source, like maybe summarize it, like, to expose the contradiction, hidden motive, or if maybe the journalists don't want to manipulate anyone, but the subject wants to manipulate people.
Yes. So just to sum up pretty much everything that we talked about so far, when the main goal of a journalist is to seek objective truth, to get as close to objective truth as possible. And the way you do that is by meticulous preparation, questioning tactics, and transparency with the audience. And meticulous preparation, we just went through some of those points. There are some internationally agreed upon code of conduct and methods. And preparing is doing the background checks of the people that are involved in the story you want to depict or journalistically treat. And then you have the questioning tactics, which is, as we initially talked about, this contradictory questions. It's one of the questioning tactics, and it's also this funneling down where you're initially doing like the broader perspectives and asking broader questions, and then you're sort of narrowing down to more specific situations, and then you have more confrontational questions. And this is what you do to either verify or debunk the credibility of your source. And it's left up to the audience to listen to what's being said and make their own judgment. And then you can journalistically do these monologues, intercepting monologues, where you're reflecting on behalf of the audience. And you're also being transparent with the audience about what you know, what you don't know, what you think, what your theories are, etc. So it's something that you record separate from the interview, but where you're giving the audience like an inside view of what's known and what's not known, what can be verified, what cannot be verified, and what kind of line of questioning that you would like to address further on. So transparency. And what these methods do is that they allow the journalist to expose these contradictions and manipulations or hidden motives without resorting to accusations or aggression, which can shut a source down, right? So by preparing these, by doing your proper preparation, so you know more than the source thinks you know, and then you have these questioning tactics, you're kind of pressing the belly of the source and allowing their reaction and responses to reveal whether there's manipulation going on. And hidden motives, also asking about motives would be a very relevant. I think, yeah.
Okay. So I think it's a good sum up of what we were talking about. Thank you very much, Emilia, and I hope this will help the audience to understand not only how to listen to this podcast, maybe you have to listen to it again, or podcast and Podimo podcast, maybe you have to listen to it again to understand now, and also to understand what you listen globally, generally, as an info. Not only we talk about generally here, we talk about a case, but also general. So now you are educated to understand what you listen on TV, because a journalist is a journalist, and some people on TV to just give their opinion or pursue an idea, an ideology, and you have to make a difference, people, between what is a source, what is an investigation, and what is a PR work, which is not the same job. And this is an insult to, in my opinion, to journalism, to mix it, because there is people that do a good job, they do investigation, and sometimes, and maybe in life, the truth can be between what you heard here on the left, what you heard on the right, and maybe it's a mix of it, or maybe it's a little bit more on the right, maybe it's a little bit more on the left, but at least when a journalist summarizes all of it, you have the right picture of what it is projected as a journalism work ethic. So thank you very much, Emilia.
You're welcome.
And have a good night, because it's already late.
It is.
Thank you.
But yeah, anytime to give a more ethical perspective, just let me know, because it's super important and on a broader scale for, in my opinion, the general public to be educated around how to understand the media push that is coming from corporate media, especially. And there have been some severe cases in Hollywood where the media has been used to do some very serious and damning smear campaigns towards specific people for very specific goals. And when in regards to Hollywood, it's often motivated by the acquisition of rights to scripts, etc. And we just had a recent case that is still ongoing between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, where he has been smeared severely by the media with accusations of like sexual assault. And then it turns out that it didn't actually happen. And the reason, the motive is most likely because he has a clause in his contract with an author to a script, where in the clause it says that if he's ever accused of sexual assault, then he loses the rights to the script. And Blake Lively really wanted the rights to that script. So by doing this smear campaign, he loses the right to the script, and then she can buy it from the author again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a severe example of how media institutions allow themselves to be doing the character assassinations for, some very nefarious purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm giving this as a broader example of this. It could be the case with this podcast as well, that this is actually something that is much more nefarious. And I think I find it very problematic that you have a so-called journalist who's using his credentials, who's using his title as a stamp of approval of this smear campaign. Mm-hmm. And it's a disservice to journalists in general. And it's a disservice to the credibility of Danish media in general.
Yes. And I leave it as the end of now the word of the end of this podcast, because this summarize everything we said just right now. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.